Good day, everybody. Been a while since I've done a video. Thought I'd put out this so-called audio podcast to YouTube just to test it out to see what would happen. I don't expect much thanks to YouTube. Anyways, I just wanted to go over the history and the de-dollarization of the US dollar through an infograph I found on Reddit, I believe. But first, I wanted to lead with this. This is Christine Lagarde, president of the ECB, European Central Bank. Tweet from Watcher.guru admits if banks don't use central bank digital currency, CBDC, they will lose control. Here it is.
In that game, if we are not involved in experimenting, in innovating in terms of digital central bank money, we risk losing the role of anchor that we have played for many, many decades. And we have historical examples of period where the central bank monetary anchor was not there, and that precipitated crisis after crisis. That certainly was the case at the time of the free banking in the 19th century. Do we want to go back to those days? Probably not. I would say certainly not from our vantage point, as a result of which we have to respond to the demand for those digital payments in order to maintain the role of anchor that we have been playing regularly.
I think it's amazing she assumes there'll be demand for these things. Look at Nigeria when they try to enforce it. They had real riots, and first they bribe people, give them $20 to join the digital currency in the country, and then, well, hey, we're going to limit you on how much money you can take out of your account. I think it was in Nigeria, it was $250, and somehow they managed to force them, not because of demand, but force them to get into this thing. Anyways, so that's one element of the CBDCs, and it is getting enough attention from the ECB president, especially, and they're trying to justify their case. So, not a good thing, obviously. And then here, I wanted to go over this right here, which I think is pretty important. Let me blow. Hopefully, you guys can see it. There we go. That should be good enough. Anyways, we're going to talk about now. This is from Reddit, and I found this on BitcoinRealm.org as well. And understanding de-dollarization. So, US dollar dominated global trade and capital flow for decades, and up until probably the 30s, 40s, 50s, probably up until World War II, maybe World War One, it was the British pound that was the one. So, however, many nations are looking for alternatives to the greenback to reduce their dependence on the U.S. Um, so, what they're doing is process of substituting U.S. dollars, the currency used for trading commodities and other goods. So, the big one is the petrodollar for oil with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's a year ago. I put this in my webinar last night, and those have access. You know what I'm talking about. And the U.S. is probably losing its dominance here as both Russia, China, the BRICS, basically, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Saudi Arabia may be joining it. I think they already committed to it. Egypt, Iran. And it's more of the bigger countries like India and Brazil you need to be worried about. So, how did this start? So, the dollar begins to displace the pound sterling. Yeah, so it was World War One. International currency, recipient of wartime gold inflows. So international trade is conducted using the dollar under the Bretton Woods Agreement. Okay. So from there, in the 60s, European and Japanese exports. So these are when both Japan and Europe, they were producing their own products for export. They became more competitive with US imports because they were cheaper, and there's a large supply of dollars around the world, making it difficult to back dollars with gold. So then we know about Nixon ceases the direct convertibility of US dollars to gold. So that may be, for some people, the start, the demise of when the Federal Reserve was now able to control and print out of nothing their own dollar equivalent to create deficits. The deficits were always there, but it was the anchoring to gold that kept the deficit and debt in line. Okay. So that's what happened in 71. So in 81, after years of hyperinflation, the US dollar loses two-thirds of its purchasing power. Does that mean anything today in today's era? Um, yeah, and that is when Economics 101 will tell you if you have rising national debt, you will get um, int- uh, you will get inflation. There's no questions asked about that. I mean, under the modern economics, they'll tell you differently because the economy is big enough and it can lump it, blah 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 blah. There's also the credibility of the country and on its dollar. So we'll get more into that. 2007 and 8, investors seek US dollars, expecting the currency to retain its value. So that's when the Fed was just pumping tons and tons of money into the economy to save the economy during that financial crisis. So along comes where things start to really accelerate as the debt starts to mount. Following the following the annexation of Crimea, Russia prioritizes. This is when it really, really started the de-dollarization in response to Western sanctions. Now, I'm not here to be some lover of Russia and Putin, but that was the start of when U.S. was weaponizing their dollar beyond means. So they were able to control and keep certain countries under the influence of the US dollar. Think Argentina, think many, many countries. And many, many countries were very worried that if they have rising debt themselves, especially in the emerging markets, let's say Sri Lanka or whatever country, and they go into a crisis, now they have debt issued in dollar. And last year in 2022, as the dollar went up, their debts were going up as well because the dollar, which is their debt is denominated in US dollar, it starts to go up as the US dollar starts to go up. So that really um, spooked a lot of countries. So the central banks buy gold at the fastest pace since 87 as countries diversify the reserves away from the dollar. So another good example of that is when Germany called in, I don't know the exact year, but they said we want our gold back when it was stored in the Federal Reserve in New York. Okay, so they got their own gold. That was like one of many things that started this whole process. So the war in Ukraine results in Western sanctions against Russia. As a result, Russia and China deepen cooperation between the financial systems, with ruble yuan trade increasing 80 times in 8 months. So yes, they are enemies of the US and pretty well enemies of the West. But that block just alone on China, just on population alone, is a big deal. Um, so now, uh, moving into from last year to this year, 2023, you get, look, Brazil, Argentina discussed the creation of their own common currency. Plus, as you heard earlier, Bitcoin is a real threat, and as well as crypto is a real threat to central banks like the ECB. And as a result, they want to, as I said, to diversify in gold, but nobody can control Bitcoin. Okay. So one of the big things with Argentina is they were considering, uh, or no, sorry, it was Brazil. Brazil considering, not will, but was considering to make Bitcoin legal tender. They're seeing the success of El Salvador and how El Salvador, as part of my webinar last night, I mentioned that El Salvador does not really need the IMF due to the fact that they now have an alternative currency called Bitcoin, which is legal tender in El Salvador, and they can mint or print or create or virtually mine their own Bitcoin with volcanoes, oddly enough, because that's an unlimited heat source, obviously, and it's real no negative impact on the environment. And because of that, they're able to generate create their own Bitcoin. So with that, with those proceeds, they can build things like schools and really build new infrastructure projects in the country because of these, oddly enough, volcanoes. So central banks like well, not central banks, but the IMF, the International Money Fund, and whoever else, the World Bank, don't like that because they want the third world emerging countries to be dependent on these world banks because it's the world banks that control these countries and basically in a form of enslavement. I guess you could call it that. So with that, they're able to Sri Lanka is a great example of that. That just recently got funding from the IMF with a bunch of uh, bailout conditions and rules they had to follow. So countries are terrified of that, and El Salvador doesn't need to be part of that. So they're stepping outside the system because they have the ability to make Bitcoin legal tender as well as generate and create their own, basically mine their own Bitcoin. So as I said, the IMF and whatnot, they don't like that. So as a result, um, and not only that, but when you look at what's going on in El Salvador, if you haven't seen the big 40,000 person prison they just built and started to put people in there, namely from the big gangs, the MS-13 and whatnot. So, from what I understand, the new leader, Bukele, has made El Salvador supposedly one of the safest countries in all of Latin America to live in. And people are pouring into this country because it's becoming Bitcoin friendly. And now Guatemala's probably following the same path. And as it said, maybe some of the bigger countries like in South America may do the same. As I said, Brazil as an example. So here we have the UAE and India explore the use of rupees to trade non-oil commodities. That's a big deal because you have India pretty well now, I think officially now, the largest populated country in the world, the largest democracy in the world, and UAE, which is now becoming essentially the new Switzerland, no tax, and becoming a very influential country as well. I personally think if any country in the world was to, let's say, have a world reserve currency, I would think it's the UAE dinar. And people think I might be nuts in saying that. But when you look at Dubai is a very highly wealthy, tax-free, influential country in the world that's kind of like played this neutral role, no different than Turkey, between Russia, now China, the East, we'll call it, and the West. And because of that, they may become a very influential country or a region, even though they are run by, I think, a offshoot of the royal family. Or I'm not a expert there. I don't know the history, but it's not a true democracy. But they're giving people to live like in a democracy somewhat. And if these countries start to join the BRICS movement, and as well the real big ones, the Saudis, and from what I understand, that I did post a story last year where they are trading China with petrodollar is now being replaced by petro yuan, the local currency to China, and that enables now the U.S. dollar to become less influential. So the other big steps there, as I said, the UAE and India explore the use of rupees, Indian rupees. Russia and Iran are working together to launch a cryptocurrency backed by gold. There's a couple of cryptos like that. PaxG is one. Uh, um, yeah, PaxG is probably the biggest one that I know of. Anyways, despite these movements, few expect the end of the global dollar's global sovereign status anytime soon. I don't know about that. I think like when you look at the value over the last few months with the DXY, the dollar index, you'll see it has fallen. Last year was very strong, 2022. But when you look at the performance over the last year to date, it's been all nothing but negative. So here you can see 3 month negative, negative 1.6%, year to date 1.06%, and just last month it's been negative 2.33. So that's due to banking collapses in the U.S. system, That's just this is probably more systematic than you know. Um, and they've identified like 180, 200 banks that could collapse because they're badly managed or whatever you want to call it. But basically, um, as I said, it's like Jerome Powell, Federal Reserve chairman, is like little boy blue looking at the face up to a dam of negative onslaught of water that's ready to blow the hole right out. And all he's doing is putting his fingers in as many holes in the dam to plug it up. But it could come down. And this is another new way of this to happen. So here's how it currently stands. Despite these movements, few expect to see the end of the dollar's global sovereign status anytime soon. I think soon, it'll be sooner than soon. Currently, central banks still hold 60% of foreign exchange reserves in dollars. Um, yeah, no. Let's put it this way. If you raise interest rates, okay, last week at 0.25% for the US dollar, for the interest rates issued by the Federal Reserve, that should be have a positive effect on the dollar because now what's happening is the US dollar should go up as the interest to park money in the US in US dollar goes up. Therefore, the US dollar should go up, but it's not. So that's distorted right there, right? So we got that to worry about. Okay, let's look at the next set of things in this document. Okay, so currently, banks still hold 60% of their loyal foreign exchange reserves in dollars. That's quickly falling, especially now as the US dollar may fall. So it's almost 60%, 20% in euro, and the rest you can see here. And then that's always going to change. But over time, I think we will start to see more and more countries piling on. And BRICS is the big influential one that will move on. Like it or love it, with what Russia is doing with this invasion on Ukraine, I don't agree with it. I want it to stop personally. I'm not a big fan of Putin or Z. But unfortunately, another video I put up from CNBC, there was a person who said, yes, the dollar will go down and become de-dollarized because of the fact that the Federal Reserve has pretty well abused its management fiscally on the US economy as well as inflation. A great example of that was where Yellen says inflation's transitory. Inflation's transitory. Okay. So that went on for a year. They didn't do anything about it. They could have done something by raising interest rates at that time to prevent what's happening now where it reached 10% and now it might be down to 6%, but they always had this target of 2% for years and they didn't do anything about it. So that's the quote unquote management that I'm talking about. And there's lots of videos I got on my channel that kind of show how they've kind of changed the data on how they, let's say, define what unemployment is. They've also gone over and trying to redefine what recession is. This is the Federal Reserve. These are supposed to be the neutral based government officials that we're supposed to trust. And well, I think that is beyond the pale, and people are losing trust and confidence in the Federal Reserve, and that's going to start to really hurt the U.S. dollar and overall the U.S. economy and the credibility overall of the U.S. government and the U.S. dollar and so on. And the other big factor is this factor of this debt ceiling, which they brought in law by law to ensure that the deficits that these governments spend are kept in line with the debt within the debt ceiling. But instead, in the last 10 years or so, they just kept raising it, kicking that can down the road, and just pretending there's no problem with it, and just push it under the rug and think it's okay. Well, it's not okay because now we have inflation. Now we have potentially collapsing banks, which could go systematic. I don't know. I'm no expert here, but I'm just giving you my opinion. Other than that, that's pretty well all I wanted to describe. But if you like this kind of info, and more about trading, you might want to go over to my quantlabs.net/books page. In there, you get access to the Trade Like a Boss, some other stuff, and now a whole slew of videos. You just opt in. There you go. Quantlabs.net/books. Hopefully you like this, and we shall maybe see you later on another YouTube video. Other than that, I do my podcast as well.